In this video, I'd like to demonstrate a few properties of the brushes that you're going to be using in this class. And the first one is the flat brush. And according to Dali, this brush has the characteristics of being parsimonious. And I suppose that means it doesn't give as much as some of the other brushes, but let's just see what it can do. So the first thing, of course, is the footprint of the brush and the kind of stroke it leaves, which is pretty regular. My brush is pretty loaded up. You can see I have paint on both sides. So when I load the brush, I turn it over and put paint on both sides. These kinds of strokes take advantage of the belly of the brush, but you can also use the toe of the brush. And because the top edge of a flat brush is very straight, you can use it to make relatively straight lines. So here I'll demonstrate how to do the edge of a cube. So the flat brush allows you to do pretty precise and controlled edges. And you can also, just once the brush is starting to exhaust the amount of paint that's in it, you can use it to kind of add in really light layers of paint. And now I'm using more of the toe of the brush. And that's how you control the amount of paint that goes down, by switching back and forth from the toe to the belly of the brush. Of course, it's still possible to use the brush, the flat brush, in a curving motion. Here the width pretty much stays the same, but if you vary the angle of the brush from the toe to the heel or the belly, you can start to get more of a kind of a calligraphy type of stroke with the brush, and it's very good for that, going back and forth between thick and thin. So the next thing I want to do is demonstrate how to blend between colors. The orange swatch next to a blue swatch, and the edge is very, very sharp. If I want to make that more of a smooth, feathered, I would call it a feathered edge, I'll dip my brush in a little bit of linseed oil, and using the toe of the brush, and you can see just by doing a series of vertical strokes, I was able to blend that out. There's another way to do that as well. Let me show you how to do that. The only difference really is instead of brushing up and down vertically, I go across the edge and do a kind of a sideways stroke. And then if I want to blend that into the orange, I'll just keep on dragging until it fades in. And now I've got a transition from blue to orange, back to blue again. Remember that applying a little bit of linseed oil to your paint helps you blend because it makes the paint more fluid. It's what's called extending the pigment. It becomes more transparent, more fluid, therefore easier to blend. The round brush is a different kind of a fish, and it comes to a nice little point like a pencil. So the kind of strokes you can make with that are much thinner. You see how much better that line is. That's because I dipped my brush in a little bit of linseed oil. If you press down until the entire belly of the brush is on the canvas and you get a wide stroke, up on the toe you get a thinner stroke. A lot like the flat brush, but the characteristic of the footprint of the brush is a little bit different. Very quick gestural movement of the round brush that gives you those kinds of strokes. So what I'm doing here is just creating a kind of a texture. And I can also add color into this. And let's add a little bit of blue on top. As I'm looking at this, I can see now I've created almost a kind of like, it looks a little bit like a pine cone. When you are painting in this manner, one way to develop the painting is to begin thinking in terms of dark and shadow. So we can think of these blue areas as shadows. And the orange isn't quite a light. I mean, it's a local color, but to be considered a highlight, we would probably want to add something lighter on top. So I'm going to take a little bit of this cadmium yellow that I've mixed with some titanium white, and I'm going to go in and selectively bring out a little bit more of a lightness. Let's see if this yellow is working. Okay, that's what it looks like with yellow. And let's add some white. And so what I'm doing is I'm just using simple strokes because these are kind of scallop shaped shapes to begin with. And a scallop shape is something very easy to make with a round brush. Now, even though I say it looks like a pine cone, I'm not attempting to represent a pine cone. I'm just looking for patterns that I can build on and trying to take advantage as much as I can of what the brush will allow me to do, which is make these scallop shapes. And now I'm going to come back with a little bit of blue. Is this going to work? Let's see. maybe some half shadows over here. And then just to add a little more structure, I'm going to come back with the blue and maybe go over some of these areas. I was starting to get a little bit fussy with it, so I'm going to just going to loosen up and let it rip here a little bit more. Okay, because the more I fuss over it, probably the more likely I am to lose the freshness that I have and the spontaneity that I have. Now, it's always possible that you don't like what you're doing, and maybe you want to mess with this a little bit. And so how can we mess with that? Let's go back to our flat brush. What I'm doing is I'm just scrambling the colors together a little bit, like scrambled eggs. And so you see that starts to blur the edges a little bit between all the different colors. One thing I recommend is if you are working on your canvas and it feels like it's getting out of control and you're not liking it at all, you can always add a little water to a rag and just go in and wipe it down. Now let's take the flat brush. So essentially what I have now is a stained surface. And so it's not as wet, it's a drier surface. And now when I go over it with the blue, it doesn't blend as easily. It blends a little bit. But you can see the texture and the grain of the canvas are much more evident. Let's play with the edge a little bit. So I'm going to take my flat brush and I want to create some relief along the edge. Now this would be an example of stippling. That's nice and thick. The values of these colors are pretty, contrast pretty well. I mean, they're warm and cool for sure. In terms of value, they aren't extreme contrasts. But if I wanted to bring a little bit more contrast into the edge, I'll bring in some black. And let's say that I don't know, wanted to just make this more of an outlined shape. Now, you can see I'm just going to trace along the edge here. And there's a lot of ways you can move a brush across the canvas. And one is kind of a sort of a nervous, shaky little brush stroke here. which gives you a lot of feel, like a snake crawling across the ground. Or you can use more of a speedy brush stroke. And when we say gesture, that's the equivalent of saying speed. And the praying mantis is associated with speed, right? Kind of a blended background like you do here with the gradient. You're really set up to, once it dries, paint figures on top of that, or even when it's wet. So let's say that I wanted to paint a figure which is really more of a line here. I can add that on top and it stands out pretty well. And it floats on that it floats on the background, on the gradient that I created. So you see the difference between the lines technique. Let's look at this part. So I've got several different strokes here, and as they go from left to right, they get a little bit fainter and less distinct. But let's say that I wanted to create a more solid shape here. And when I say shape, I mean this kind of a rectangle. So I'm going to take just a little bit of linseed oil on my brush and use this technique I call cloudy hand. What I can do now is set up a texture of brush strokes. So I can do hatching, which is just short strokes. I can do cross hatching, so I can, on top of that, put vertical strokes. I can do diagonals, do wiggles. You can also get a nice fuzzy feathered effect like this too. Let's make this fuzzy. All right, let's do that. Let's make everything fuzzy. It's already fuzzy. Bye-bye, cube. And let's, let's intervene this here a little bit. Let's see what we can do. Let's maybe work with an organic shape. Okay, let's maybe, well, I don't know. What does my brush want to do? Okay. Oh, I guess it wants to do that. All right. There's not really a name for this technique, but it's kind of flipping the brush back and forth. And as long as I'm in the neighborhood, let's go play with this black border here. You can also think of your brush strokes like musical notes in terms of tempo, right? So a short note is a dash, a longer note is drawn out, maybe given a little amplitude. Here comes a note. It's going to start off very steady, and then as it grows, it goes wider and wider until it fades out. Now let's have some real fun. Let's just load up this brush and let's drag it down and see what happens. Very cool. Very nice. I like that. I feel like we need some more just strong orange somewhere in here. Here's a strong orange, here's a strong orange. This orange is a little bit diluted. Maybe we can do, how about right here in the middle of this blue? Let's see if it gives us a little bit of dynamic range and pop. Shall we follow that curvy line? So the impasto of the orange basically overpowers the thin layer of the blue and completely dominates and just sits on there like a nice abstract expressionist brushstroke. I'm asking you to be non-representational, and so that's hard for students sometimes, for beginning painters, because there's no ideal form to guide what you're doing. In other words, if I asked you to paint an apple, that would be much easier than just painting something abstract out of your head. One way to guide yourself is to ask yourself, how am I balancing the various forces? So one way we do that is you distribute things more or less evenly across the surface. And by that I mean, for instance, a color. So when you look at this, you see that no part of the painting isn't without some amount of orange. And so there's a bit here on the right side, there's a line on the bottom, there's a line on the top and on the left. So that's pretty well balanced. Same thing with the blue, and it's much easier since I'm only using two colors. Okay, so there you are, and good luck with your subjective color painting assignments.